For those who weren't here for the last session, I'm Jerry Blackman. I have a practice in Virginia Beach, Virginia. I'm a professor at Eastern Virginia Medical School in Norfolk. I'm also a training and supervising analyst with the Freudian Society in Washington, D.C.
William?
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you want to design?
What's that?
I think I'm still looking here. I think it's one that Claude Helene Mayer is the.
Someone needs to mute themselves so that Professor Blackman can continue his presentation without interruption. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I'm going in this presentation. I want to approach anti-Semitism from the standpoint of it being a type of prejudice, and I realize that there are economic, geophysical, geographical, political. There are many different and historical features to anti-Semitism. But in this, I'm going to focus on the psycho of the psychohistory. I want to focus on some analytic ideas, which I hope will contribute to our understanding of it. And I invite you to share your thoughts after I go through this. Prejudice starts with projection. I think Suzanne mentioned that earlier. That's when you have something about yourself that you don't like, and you say, okay, that other person has it instead of me. Right? With prejudice, that you then get generalizations, another defensive operation. It's not just him, it's his whole group that I hate. Right? Then Freud added a couple of ideas. He figured, well, in a group, the group members tend to identify with the values of the leader. And the leader comes to represent one of the parents. At that time, Freud thought it was the father. It could certainly be a mother. But it's a parental authority, which is chosen. It's seen as somewhat, and people identify with. It's a defense we now call identification with the idealized object. In addition, Freud figured out that group members identify with each other. Now, still, you notice we're talking about individual dynamics. And after I get done with this, I'll show you some of the group dynamics that also apply. So if the members of the group identify with the leader who is patently anti-Semitic, then they're all going to espouse anti-Semitic beliefs. And you have this with this guy, Sinawar, who is the head of Hamas right now. And he's a virulent anti-Semite. He was in prison in Israel for a long time. And they let him go in a swap for an Israeli citizen. All right, now, yeah, so we already noticed that aside from identifications with the value system of the leader and identifications with other people in the group, S.R. Slavson said, well, in any type of group, the group itself, not the leader, but the group itself can become unconsciously seen as a mother of support. So everybody agrees and they're in the group and they feel safe. Now, we can add Kernberg's idea about splitting to this, that what's projected by one group onto another is some negative aspect of people. And that negative aspect, by Kernberg's definition, is violent, destructive aggression. Right? There's the aggression that's not assimilated in any particular part of the group, where they decide as a group they're going to project that and see the other group as evil, entirely evil, which distorts the way they see the other group. Right? And you can add sometimes a defense of dehumanization, which is typical during wartime. I mean, look at the way that the United States even used language about the Japanese during World War II. My parents, who were World War II people, throughout their lives, they referred to the Japanese as Japs. I mean, that was that, or the yellow peril, that sort of thing. But there has to be another factor that can make prejudice more virulent, and that factor is reification. Reification is kind of a strange word. I think it was made up by Hoken Politan in Columbia in 1949. But reification means you make it real. It's not, you don't just project it and generalize it and project the split violence that you feel yourself and then generalize it onto the group and identify with the leaders and identify with other people, but it becomes real and it's somehow magnified by certain realities. And I thought, I mentioned again that the TV series Fauda, F-A-U-D-A, which I thought was excellent. And it shows how this happens. How does it get reified? Through, well, somebody gets killed and you get mad, you want revenge. And then there's a circle of revenge. Also, in prejudice, you get group regression. Now, what does that mean? What does group regression mean? It means that a certain amount of reality testing is lost. Certain amount of object relatedness is lost. So now the other group where this has become reified, right? Now we think it's really them. It might be really them, right? But maybe it isn't. The other group is really dangerous to us, right? And we're not going to use our abilities to form relationships and see other people as whole people, and we're not going to test reality that way. I remember there was a George Carlin joke years ago. George Carlin said he had a way of stopping war. It said you only had to get every person in the world to meet every other person and shake hands with them. And that way, when there was going to be a war, people would say, I can't have a war against that guy. I know him. I shook hands with him. But it was kind of non-analytic way of commenting on an analytic concept. That's hard to destroy somebody if you like them and you see them as human beings. Now, another thing that you see in the college campuses deal is fear of ostracism. The fear of ostracism is social anxiety. And a lot of the kids feel if they don't join the group that they'll be ostracized somehow. There's a very powerful force in late adolescence and young adults, sometimes continues. Right. Now,
Suzanne, would you mute yourself, please?
Yeah.
I don't know how, I'm trying.
At the bottom left, there's a button that says,
Bottom left.
at the bottom left, scroll down and you'll see a little thing that says mute. Just click that.
I can find it.
Yeah. Or the leader can do it too. He can, anyway.
That would be great.
Another mechanism which we see is displacement. So not only are we projecting, do prejudiced people project onto other people, but they displace the rage they feel towards some member of their family onto an outside group. And very often the leaders of these groups know that that's a mechanism which they encourage. They encourage the displacement outside the group. So I recently heard an interview it was done by Jordan Peterson. It's on YouTube. He was interviewing the guy who's the son of the man who started Hamas. And the son, he's an interesting guy. His son explained that he turned against Hamas when he was about 18 because they were physically torturing him. Anytime he did something wrong, they would tie him up to a post and whip him with a whip until he was bleeding and screaming. And this went on frequently. And you can see that the mechanism that the Hamas people are using is to whip their own children, beat them, not just teach them, but beat them. And then the child will have massive homicidal rage towards their parents for doing that. What they do then is shame them and tell them, no, don't hate us, hate the Jews. They're the ones who want to hurt you. So you have, it's not just the reality of it, but this mechanism of displacement in the face of child abuse. Now, Freud also talked about an interesting phenomenon that he called the narcissism of minor differences. And I'll build on what Suzanne Sepperson said, which is that, and from actually knowing from Arabs and Israelis, it's very hard to tell them apart. I mean, if you meet them, a lot of them look very similar. And the languages, Arabic and Hebrew, are very similar. So a lot of Israeli people speak Arabic, and a number of Arabic people also study Hebrew, not as many. But they're languages that are sisters to each other. And yet they hate each other, right? So you have this narcissism of minor differences. We're different from you. You also get in anti-Semitism a regression in ego strength. What does that mean? That means the usual mechanism to control impulses slips. So instead of thinking, well, I don't want to kill somebody, no, the superego gets involved and impulse control is relieved, and they go out and kill people and don't feel guilty about it. Mostly on the Arab side, they feel pleasure in killing Jews, and they feel they're living up to their ego ideal, whereas most Jews feel guilty about it. They have to do it. They feel guilty. So there's a difference in the ego ideal of both societies, as far as I know. Then we get primitive idealization of one's own group. We're the best, right? I remember when I was in college, I had a guy in my dorm was from Brooklyn. And he said it to me, he said, all the great people in history have been Jewish. He said, yeah, Freud, Marx, Einstein. I said, well, how about Darwin? He said, Darwin was Jewish. No, he wasn't. Anyway, but there can be an overvaluation. And the same thing with the Arabs. They overvalue themselves and think the other person is devalued. And one of the theories about why the Israelis didn't see the attack coming, if in fact they didn't see it coming, and there's some question about that. But considering they didn't see it coming, one of the reasons was they devalued the Gazans. They thought they were stupid. They didn't think an attack like that could be coordinated and mounted. So they made a big mistake because of the devaluation mechanism. Turning of the superego outward. Turning the superego outward is a defense that I described. And I wrote a little book about this called 101 Defenses some years ago about defense mechanisms. Anyway, turning the superego outward is where you feel very critical of yourself or whatever, but you don't like it. So you find something in somebody else and you criticize them instead, right? It makes it maybe involving some projection of the self onto the other person first, but anyway, you turn the superego on them. How many times does somebody say to you, why did you do that? That was stupid. And you say, wait a minute, I didn't do that. And the person says, oh, well, I was critical of myself. You can get this in the development of prejudice too, right? It's the Jews who are bad, right? We're not bad, they are. Right? Criticism of us. Then there's the incorporation of oral history. Right? It's partly learned, it's partly identified with, and it's passed down from generation to generation. So the Palestinians are teaching their children to hate Jews. The most common song in Israel for 15 years was a little song called I Hate Israel. It was a popular song. And I was teaching a guy a few years ago who was Egyptian, and he was a Copt. And we got a little bit friendly, and we were talking about anti-Semitism, and he told me about this song. Otherwise, I wouldn't have known about it. All right, so there's individual dynamics. I may be leaving out some. Then we have group dynamics that create anti-Semitism. First, there's interaction. So the Palestinian Arabs interact, and they interact with other groups around the world, and they get them to hate Jews. They induce affects, mutual induction of affects in a group, right? So we see these groups on campus, they're chanting, right? Which gives them group cohesion also. It's a phony thing, but it gives them a sense of group cohesion. And they generate affects in each other. So from the river to the sea and so on and so forth, let's destroy the Jews. From the river to the sea, we'll destroy the Jews was a later version of that chant. They interstimulate each other about ideas in the group. I have an idea, you have an idea. And before you know it, Jews are evil, Jews are colonists. I don't know, Jews are genocidal. I mean, all these kinds of distorted ideas are promoted by interstimulation. Credentialing is also important when you have to belong to a group. You have to prove that you have the same idea, maybe you wear the same clothing, you have the same haircut, you wear the same kind of clothing's a big deal. If you look at all these groups on campus, there's a uniform, you know, it's the student uniform. All right, so that's using small group dynamics, which are described by Slobson. Then we get to large group dynamics that cause anti-Semitism. And these are described in 50 books by Volkan, right? Vamek pointed out that there are chosen traumas and chosen glories. So for the Jews, the chosen trauma is the Holocaust, right? It all happened to them, ain't going to happen again, and so on and so forth. And they got attacked again, like the Holocaust on October 7th. And that's it. They're not taking it sitting down. It's a chosen trauma. And it brings them together, even though there are many disparate political groups in Israel who don't agree with each other at all. This large tent idea that they're all victims of the Holocaust, this chosen trauma, will bring them together, at least for a while. Chosen glories would be the success in the 1967-73 wars and so on. And with the Palestinians, the trauma, they say, was being expelled from their country in 1948. Of course, in a very good book by Alan Dershowitz called The Case for Israel, he points out that the Arabs were actually not expelled. A lot of them ran away because the other Arab countries were coming in to destroy Israel. And a lot of them before that sold their land to the incoming Jews. It was not stolen from them. But it's a distorted idea that's been promulgated. You also have time collapse. So you see in this group phenomena that the Arabs are still talking about 1948. Some of them are talking about the Balfour Declaration, 1917 or something. Time collapse. They're bringing up older stuff to promote their own prejudice. And the incorporation of propaganda that's spread purposely. Let's not forget that the Gazans are purposely spreading propaganda by showing, you know, these horrible movies of children dying, and also by exaggerating the number of casualties they've had. There haven't been 39,000 casualties, but we don't really know. And as others have mentioned, is de-animation by a group of the enemy, right? One of my favorite World War II movies is called Saboteur, you know, looking for the enemy. Now, the other thing that Volkan has written about in large groups is established pathological mourning. In other words, they never get over any loss they've felt. There's very little grieving. So they're taking up arms to use violence as a way of defending against the painful grief that they felt because they're expelled from different countries. Egypt doesn't want the Palestinians, for example. Jordan doesn't want them. They have nowhere to go. And this is very painful to them. Whatever they've lost in the past years, they don't resolve it. Certainly the same thing is true of Israelis. A lot of established pathological mourning. They're still kind of in mourning for the people they've lost, and they're defending against it with anger. Then we get to transgenerational transmission. What happens in transgenerational transmission, as you may know, is that the people who survive are carrying with them the trauma that happened to somebody else, right? And in the most pathological situations, they deposit this misery into somebody else, usually a child, and the child carries it around with them. So this is very easy for the Palestinians to do because they can distort a lot of things, right? And what happened to them in 1963, 1967, 673, even 1948, all of these older things, even though the Arabs started all, they can easily turn it around and project and say we were victimized by the Israelis and the Jews. And then they inject that into their children. See what happened to Uncle so-and-so. See what happened to your grandfather, killed by the Jews. That's all. But then you've got the trauma deposited into the children. It's not, and that aggravates the act of teaching they do to hate Jews, and it aggravates the fact that they whip their children and then tell them to displace the anger onto Jews. Finally, I think there's some psychopathic, meaning not having any of these values, but not having a conscience. So there are some people who are funding this, funding anti-Semitism right now, for example, like George Soros and Hamas, who are looking to make money. And they're paying money to different people. There's a lot of corruption going on in these protests. You can see it because all 100 protests around the world are the same. They involve Coleman tanks, they involve pre-printed brochures and so on and so forth. There are people behind this stuff. It's not random. So what are the motives of the people who are doing this? I think they're primarily financial. So there's a psychopathic motive behind it. There's also a wish for power. And you can see this very, very clearly in Vladimir Putin, where it's just oozing all out of him that everything he says is designed to get power. Power over Ukraine, but maybe power over other countries, possibly including in the Middle East. We're not sure if Putin wants to get a hold of them too. So Putin would be in favor of creating chaos in the Middle East because eventually it would fit his world domination feelings. He would not only take over Ukraine and the Balkans, maybe take over Lebanon and Israel and get a port there into the Middle East. It's hard to say when somebody is psychopathic and they have dreams of power, what they're going to do. Look what Hitler was able to accomplish. Look what Alexander the Great was able to accomplish. These psychopathic guys who want to take over and run your life. And finally, I guess we have to mention that there's a sycophantic element where people will glom on to the anti-Semitic movement because they want some kind of recognition for themselves as a star. They want to be part of the movement, part of the grandiose acclaim that they feel they're getting, and they may get involved in this sort of thing too. All right, so I quickly tried to review for you the individual defensive operations that I have gleaned from the literature and about the things that contribute to prejudice, the small group dynamics that I see that go into it, and some of the larger group dynamics described by Volkan, as well as some corrupt psychopathic mechanisms from a psychoanalytic standpoint. And I hope you like listening to some of these ideas, and I certainly look forward to listening to some of yours.